All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining for our press gaggle for our December board meeting. We're going to be taking questions from our journalists in the audience, and then we will go to those in our virtual audience. So if we're ready to get set, the first question is from Clayton from the Daily News.
Hi, guys. A question, I'm looking for a little bit more detail on the Terminal 1 project, specifically two ends of this. Can you give us a more thorough breakdown of how the cost of the project increased by about $2 billion from 2 years ago, and why the schedule, the timeline of construction, was pushed back by 2 years? It was the time that it takes, not the completion date, but the time that it takes for construction increased by 2 years, and the cost went up by $2 billion. So can you explain those increases and what's changed beyond the pandemic in the last 2 years on the project?
So I'll take the timeline first. The timeline, you have to start with the fact that the pandemic hit and the fully negotiated arrangements and agreements with respect to the deal had to be simply set aside. With the drop, as I'm sure you recall, in March and April of last year, which is when this project was slated to both have financial close and with construction to follow shortly after it, air traffic dropped to 2% of its prior 2019 levels. So both parties recognized that the deal had to be rethought, the arrangements had to be rethought, and that took almost between 18 and 20 months. So there was simply 2 years of delay built in from what we had originally planned due to the pandemic and the need to restructure the deal. Part of the restructuring of the deal involved precisely what we've called phasing, but that means the time period over which the project was to be built was extended. It was intentional. It was the result of the uncertainty or the degree of risk that and imprecision to some extent to be able to project the return of air traffic, so that what the new schedule is intended to do is to align the building of the phases of the project with the return and recovery of air traffic. Now, one of the consequences of both simply the delay of 2 years and the extension of the timeline for the project to be built injects cost increases. Time is money in the construction business. So the 2-year delay of being able to get a shovel in the ground itself escalates costs. Inflation and supply line issues are also a part of the calculation, the projection, the need for contingencies. The inflation rate is another consideration. So these are projections, but it is essentially the combination of the delay in the start of the project, the intentional expansion in terms of the timeline on which the project is projected to be built.
No, that's all.
All right, thank you. We're now going to go to our virtual audience, and the first person that we're going to hear a question from is Kevin Dugan from AM New York.
Hey, thank you for taking my question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great, thanks. I wanted to follow up on something you said, Rick. You mentioned about the PD handing out masks and interactions. I was wondering, do you have a number on the amount of summonses they've issued for mask non-compliance during that time? And then I have a separate topic I'd like to ask about as well.
We do have a number. I believe the number, but just confirm with us. But from memory, it's 163.
Got it. Thanks. And my second question is, I want to see if there's any update on the expert panel for the LaGuardia Air Train. You know, has there been what has happened since last month's meeting, and do you have any timeline for when we might see, you know, any recommendations or any kind of next steps on this?
Well, there is no specific timeline other than we're trying to do it as expeditiously as possible. The panel has begun meeting. We've begun, the work in terms of the analysis is fully and aggressively underway. And the only thing I can say at this point is what I've repeatedly said, which is we want it to move forward as expeditiously as possible.
Next question is from Larry Higgs from Star Ledger.
Larry, are you there?
Mute may be on, Larry.
Yeah, how you doing?
Hey, Larry.
Two different topics for you. The first one regards the budget. The New Jersey Turnpike Authority and South Jersey Turnpike Authority decided to take a toll increase, even though that they've seen an increase in their toll revenues. The Port Authority did not take a toll increase. And I was curious what led to that decision not to take a toll increase in a year when you saw your revenues decline.
Well, Larry, this is Rick. The framework of the tolls and fares at this point have been set by the board action in 2019. And at this point, the toll increases, if they take place, will be based on inflation. So there was no, the inflation in this past year did not trigger an increase, and future increases will be determined by the inflation rate as it progresses through each year.
Okay. The second question is about there's money coming from the federal government. Basically, $42 million was awarded by the U.S. DOT today for Newark Liberty. And basically want to get an idea of how that will help you out and what sort of work that will be allocated for.
Well, it's an important sum of money. It's, although it is significantly below the revenue loss that the agency has suffered. But the guidelines, so the answer is the total, the gross sum, if I can say that, the total sum of money to be allocated to each airport, this was to all airports across the country, was announced today. What hasn't been announced is the guidelines in terms of the specific elements of expense that the money can be applied to. And depending upon those guidelines, it will determine whether those funds accrue to the benefit of airports or whether they accrue, at least in part, to the benefit of airlines. And we need to wait until the guidelines have been released to be able to understand exactly what amount of the money will be available to pay for cost elements that the airport itself is responsible for. So we'll have clarity over the next couple of months, and that's when we'll make the decision.
Our next question comes from Paul Burton from the Bond Buyer. Paul, what's your question?
Okay, can you folks hear me now?
Yes.
Great, thanks for your time. Regarding the JFK Terminal project, a lot of talk is about, the headlines are often about the shiny new terminals, but maybe you folks can talk a little bit about the importance of the infrastructure improvements around the airport, because none of the New York area airports are easy to get to. Somebody I talked to earlier this week said the signage near JFK on the Van Wyck Expressway, he called it 50 years out of date, and said, if you miss an exit, you better have a good phone. So maybe you can talk about the infrastructure improvements, what the Port Authority hopes to accomplish, and how can they make that a better experience for the people going to the airport?
Well, there are several elements of the project that address that. I'll come to the roadways right away, but let me just say we have budgeted a very substantial amount of money to increase the capacity of the JFK air train and to improve various aspects of the stations. And that is a very important contribution to getting to the airport. We have devoted, we can get you the number. I believe we're going to spend but close to $800 million. That's not the exact number, but we can get it to you. But in terms of the infrastructure on the airport, the Port Authority is going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in terms of improving it, improving the layout of the roadways, improving, certainly improving the signage, improving, expanding the garages, adding, really improving all aspects of the frontages, the pickup and drop-off facilities, particular focus on being sure that arriving passengers can find their way to their access transportation, meaning taxis, rideshare services like Uber and Lyft, private cars if they're being picked up by their loved ones. And all of that will receive substantial investment in order to improve the actual operation or the actual functionality of roadways. We will eliminate traffic lights to the maximum extent possible, many different improvements. If you go to the Van Wyck, the state is undertaking a major rebuild of the Van Wyck. They are adding another lane in each direction. The bridges, because the lanes are being widened, all of the overpasses are themselves going to have to be significantly rebuilt. And as part of that rebuilding by the state, we will be working together so that the approaches of the Van Wyck will be much better signed, and which will be improved in terms of the fact that the Van Wyck going into Manhattan is if you're an arriving passenger, it's the gateway. So all of those are intended to be addressed by the project that New York State Department of Transportation is undertaking.
Thank you.
All right, I think we've come to the end of the questions. I'm just going to call to make sure that we didn't miss anybody that's on the line. Jeff Yapalata, did you have a question? Pat McGeehan from the Times. Pat, you can ask your question.
Yes, I have a question.
Hi, Pat.
Hi, Rick and Kevin. Here's my question. Given your operation of the Hudson River crossings and the bus terminal and the path and all that office space that you have on your property, you should probably have as good an idea as anyone about what's likely to happen in the return to office movement next year. What are your assumptions now about how commuting will change on out?
Well, there is a planning department in the agency, and there are planners within each of the divisions of the agency, and they collaborate on building in projections which become the basis for a budget process. I think those are displayed or will be displayed. But the process is, it relies very heavily on a multitude of factors, as I'm sure you know. It is based on econometric projections of the economy itself. It is based on econometric projections as to job creation in the region. It has to make some estimates in terms of whether there's going to be a modal shift. Obviously, there is to some extent at the present time, where we're seeing at the bridges and tunnels a recovery right now to pre-pandemic 2019 levels in terms of vehicles going across the bridges, through the tunnels. So people are clearly getting back in their cars. On the other hand, if you look at our commuter railroad, it for the last few months has been, it increased gradually. At the beginning of 2021, it was down about 75% from pre-pandemic levels. In the last few months, the PATH's ridership increased to about 50% and stayed there for a period of time. The latest percentage that I've seen is that it is for the last few days been 44% down, so it's crept up over the 50% level. But the experts, if I can call them that, who have been looking at all of the econometric data have made projections off of that, and they do project varying rates of growth, continued growth, with respect to PATH, with respect to the airports. We do believe that there will be a continuing recovery. Obviously, there may be ups and downs. We've seen surges of the virus, but what the horizon is, or the effort is to try to look through and find a trend line through these various ups and downs, and that's what they've done, and that's what the basis of our activity projections have been based on.
Hey, Patrick, let me just add some context to that. So when this, pandemic hit, we had some of the, Wall Street folks make these projections, baseline of 2019, and talk about whether the actual and whether you have a conservative or aggressive projections. And we have those maps going back in the middle of pandemic. Do you have a copy of those, Patrick? If you don't, you should get them, because it is remarkable on how accurate those forecasts have been within range, whether it's PATH, whether it's airport, ports, truck and car traffic, bus terminal traffic, astonishingly accurate. Obviously, Delta threw us into a loop. We were tracking well to return to work. It seemed like most of the folks were looking to come back, if not in the fall, certainly January of 22. This new variant has obviously thrown another curveball, but I think if it follows the Delta variant, this is just me talking, that we should continue our positive growth, and by the end of 22, beginning 23, hopefully we can have close to a full recovery. But if you don't have a copy of those forecasts, Patrick, you may want to get that to tell the broader story.
All right, thank you.
All right, I think that concludes our questions. If anyone else has questions that is on the line, please feel free to email us at press@panyj.gov, and have a happy holiday to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
See everybody in February.